you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you and welcome for your interest in my topic. I hope I live up to your expectations. What I would like to do today is to talk about gender budgeting. And I guess as a kind of prerequisite to my remarks, what I wanted to say is that when this current government was sworn in 2015, there was some shock and remark because 50% of the cabinet were female. And when the Prime Minister was asked why 50%, he said, because it's 2015. And of course, that was a quote that went around the world. I want to contrast that, perhaps, with a bit of another surprising reality, that in 1995, the United Nations released its Human Development Report. And in that Human Development Report, there are a series of indicators where they rank countries according to level of development. At that particular time, Canada was right up there. They also have something called a Gender Development Index, which looks at things like opportunities in employment, longevity in terms of life, and education. And they disaggregate that by gender. And there, Canada was #1. If you look about 20 or 30 years later, the current period, Canada is now at 25, ranked at 25. So that was a big surprise to me when I went back to look at it. And I'm trying to get this to work so that I can show you my slides there. It was a big surprise to me, and it led me to start thinking about not just why that was the case, but what might be some new ways in which we could think about closing the gender gap in Canada. So I want to talk to you today about one area that's often not linked to discussions of gender equality goals, and that's our national budget and the sort of dirty word taxes, as well as spending. And I hope I can convince you that if we take a gender-sensitive approach to looking at the national budget, then that would be one way in which we can make a lot of headway to close that gender inequality gap. So let me start by showing you this slide, because one of the things that I want to argue is that we don't, in fact, take into account everything that gets produced in our economy. So that's a starting point. And I'm sure you've heard this argument before, that household work or unpaid care work in the home is something that we don't take into account in our national income statistics, so our gross domestic product. But as you can see here, if it was measured, it could actually account for quite a significant amount of our gross national product. Now, the fact that it's not measured, of course, is because it's not paid for, but we know that if people do pay for the kind of functions that take place in the household, childcare, laundry, cooking, then it does become part of the national accounts, and it is measured. I want to suggest that because it's not measured, and because women do the bulk of unpaid care work in the Canadian economy, recent statistics show that they do about 10 hours more work a week than men in unpaid work, that has actually significant impacts for their ability to participate full-time in the labor market. And secondly, it also has, I think, a lot of implications for the kind of occupations that they can go into, because often a lot of the non-traditional occupations that you don't find women in. They have more inflexible hours, and again, it limits their participation in those areas. So this is one of the reasons why I think a lot of people are suggesting affordable childcare is a very, very important goal. And we can talk about that a little bit in the question and answer period, because there are some moves underway to try to bolster try and bolster that particular aspect through the federal budget. But I think that we can also look to examples within Canada that are pioneering. For example, in Quebec, one of the ways in which they're trying to redistribute unpaid childcare between male and female partners is by having a paternity leave program that gives 5 weeks to fathers. So it's mandatory for them to take it. And they have an uptake of 78% compared to about 25% in the rest of Canada. So I think that that's a really interesting example of how public policy can actually begin to change norms and can actually help to change the division of labor around some of these questions. Okay, so what is gender budgeting, or what is gender responsive budgeting? You might recall that in the last budget in February, the government came out with a gender budget statement that was part of its actual budget, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I think that there's a lot of examples all over the world of people doing gender responsive budgeting, but there aren't as many examples in the more wealthy countries. And so I want to situate Canada in that context. Now, when you talk about gender responsive budgeting, the goal of that is not to have a 50-50 share of whatever government spends going towards men and women, nor is it a 50-50 taxation situation. What it's really asking government to do, and people who are making decisions about spending and taxation, is ask these questions that you see up here. If they're deciding on a new fiscal measure, what kind of impact might that have on gender equality? Does it leave it unchanged? Does it increase it or reduce it? And I'll give you some examples in the lecture of what I mean by this. Okay, so what I thought I would do is just give you a little bird's eye view of what is going on in the wealthy countries. And the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, it's based in Paris, has, along with the IMF, just done a pretty substantial study to see are countries using this tool, which was really developed more through the United Nations for developing countries or countries of the global south, but to what extent are rich countries using it? And here is a quote from one of their journals where they make the argument that public policies and the allocation of public resources in many ways have helped to reinforce existing inequalities. So this is the premise that they start with. And they did a survey of all of the countries, and what they found in response to their survey was that there were 12 countries that says, yes, we're doing some kind of gender-sensitive analysis of the decisions we make about how we spend and how we tax. And you can see the countries here before you. Now, they asked Canada, and Canada said, no, we don't do it. We don't do gender budgeting, but as I just mentioned, there was a statement where they made a commitment in 2017, the new government, that they were going to start doing this analysis. And one of the promising things about it was that they came to the conclusion that the things that they did look at, that there were more than 60 measures in the budget that were identified as having differential gender impacts. But, and this is always the caveat, there's lots of areas where they don't have the data. So I think that this is one of the challenges, because I think often we can use the sort of excuse that we don't have the data for not doing this kind of analysis. And I think that there's lots of creative ways and lots of techniques that can be used where existing data can be employed to do a gender-based analysis. And in fact, I'll give you an example at the end of my talk of some work that a colleague and and I have done, where we looked at tax expenditures, in other words, tax credits, and did a gender-based analysis. Now, one of the sort of negative things about the last federal budget, despite the fact that they looked at these 60 measures, which was a good start, is that they didn't look at the tax side at all. And of course, the tax side is very, very important because it can have a huge kind of redistributional impact, and who pays and who benefits differs quite a lot as you move up and down the scale of income. The other thing that they, I think, are resistant to doing is looking at social infrastructure as investment. So what do I mean by social infrastructure? It's things like schools, healthcare clinics, childcare centers, versus the traditional kind of what economists call fiscal stimulus, which really means that they spend on bridges, roads, and those kinds of things. And usually the way in which economists think about investment is they think that if you're paying teachers, if you're paying nurses, if you're paying childcare workers, then that's a cost. Whereas if you're paying construction workers and engineers, then that's an investment. So I think that one of the things that needs to change in terms of the mindset is to think about social infrastructure being as important as physical infrastructure. And in fact, there's research in the United States that has shown that if you invest in social infrastructure, then you actually add 4%. Sorry, let me put it the other way around. If you invest 4% of your gross domestic product in social infrastructure, then employment increases by 3.5% versus 1.2% in physical infrastructure. And the reason for that is because social infrastructure is very labor intensive. It's, as I said, it's things like nursing, teaching. And secondly, it's where women are concentrated. About 2 in 5 women work in those sectors. So I would urge the federal government to think about, if they want to close the gap, then one of the things that they should really start thinking about is social infrastructure investment. Now, the final thing, well, I've already talked about unpaid work. But the final thing has to do with kind of the macro context, which sets the frame for policies. When we talk about macroeconomics, what that really means is the big picture. So it's, as I already said, spending, taxation, it's interest rates, it's employment, it's growth, all of these things. And a lot of economists will say, well, macroeconomics doesn't really have anything to do with gender because macroeconomics isn't about people. It's about these other flows and things that economists are interested in. But something that I've been arguing for a long time, and others have argued, is that in fact, the kind of macroeconomic decisions we make about, for example, how quickly we pay down a deficit by, for instance, cutting the public sector, that has very gendered effects, because we know that a lot of women are concentrated in good jobs in the public sector. And I'll give you an example in a moment of some very interesting research from the United Kingdom, which has looked exactly at those kinds of decisions and the impacts that those are going to have on the population, on men versus women. Now, of course, there's different ways in which you can make an argument for gender responsive budgeting. One is to be very economic oriented and to say, yes, it's more efficient. And I think that you can make that argument, and I'll suggest it in a moment. But I think that there's also a commitment that Canada has made for many, many years through various international treaties to ensuring everyone's fundamental human rights. So through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Canada is a signatory to the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And all of those obligate the government to make a commitment to harness policies in such a way that they would meet those goals. Well, what are some of the efficiency arguments? And these would be more the kinds of arguments that you hear from organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And I wouldn't say that these are wrong arguments, but I think that it's very important to keep in mind also the human rights dimension. First of all, the idea that gender inequality actually costs. And I would say it doesn't just cost women in terms of lower wages or less hours worked or maybe less savings over a lifetime. It also costs the economy, because if we were actually to close the employment gap between women and men, then we know that Canada's GDP would go up by 4%. If we were to employ the 670,000 women who are involuntary part-time workers, we would add about an extra $19 billion to the economy and wages. So there's good reasons for tapping those resources, but we also want to keep in mind that oftentimes women who come into the workforce are already very overtapped in terms of the care work that they do, that they're not being paid for. So we have to be mindful of balancing those things. There's also something that economists call false economies. Funny term, but it's really an idea that if government makes a decision to, for example, save in an area by cutting back, that maybe in the future they'll actually have to invest more money in that area. So again, if you cut back in the area of social services, then you may have a decline in overall health, you may have increased poverty, and in that way it's a false economy of saving, because in the end government has to reinvest in other ways. And of course, I think one of the most efficient things that you can say to decision makers is, look, this is a much more efficient way of managing everyone's resources, the nation's resources, because you're actually really targeting and seeing who gets what and how and why. Now, the rights kind of arguments, as I said, they really situate themselves in international law and in Canada's commitments to women's rights. And one of the things that they tell governments is that they're required to use maximum available resources to realize human rights and gender equality. And of course, that's a flexible term, and it depends on the context, but that's a commitment governments made. They are also committed to realizing equitable outcomes, not just between women and men, but also in terms of income groups, and something called substantive equality. So not just formal equality where you can vote or you have equal access, but actually looking at outcomes to see if the situation improves. Now here you have this lovely picture of the G7, and as you can see, there's not a lot of women decision makers. And this kind of picture always brings to mind some media articles that came out after the financial crisis in 2008 that said, what if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters? And it was this argument that if you had more women in there, you wouldn't have had that kind of crisis because women are more risk averse, etc. There's a lot of debate about that kind of thesis, and I think that what I would just caution about it is that you have to keep in mind the context in which people are working. So Janet Yellen, who's the chair of the US Fed, and Christine Lagarde, who's the director of the International Monetary Fund, they work within the same constraints as the gentlemen who are the other finance ministers sitting here and standing here do. But it's very interesting that they do push the boundaries a little bit more, and they do have an awareness of gender as a variable in financial discussions. And you can see that in the speeches they do. So I've just tried to outline some of the benefits that one might capture from gender budgeting. Now, I should say that there's no one way in which to do it. So I've had a lot of talks with the current government where they keep saying to me, well, how do you do it? We want to do it, but how do you do it? And all we can say is, well, you start with what you have and try to get as much data as you can, as possible, on men versus women, different groups of women, different groups of men, and start trying to analyze how your policies are going to refract back on those groups. You can see here there's about 2/3 of rich countries that have introduced gender budgeting, and they basically try to develop what are called indicators. So these are measures that are usually like composite statistical measures that put together things like the Gender Equality Index, the three things: education, health, longevity. And they try and assess whether their policies, especially once they become aware of differences, will have an impact over time. Well, it's mainly over the last 10 years that countries have been bold enough to think about using this kind of technique for managing their public finances. And you can see that a lot of countries report what are called sector-specific results. So if you look at the education sector and labor markets, a lot of them say, through this kind of analysis, we now have improved access. We've certainly reduced income inequality. If we start thinking about direct versus indirect taxes, we know that value-added taxes tend to hit poor people more since they have less income, and a lot of women are concentrated in the poor segment. So if they improve that, that can help. It's improved welfare and a greater access to childcare, and as I said, equality in taxes. Now, Iceland was an interesting country because after the financial crisis, they kicked out the entire government and they brought in a government almost all of women. And the prime minister was a woman. And so they introduced gender budgeting, and they were able to tweak and work with their tax system because they realized that secondary earners were being treated in a discriminatory way, and oftentimes women were secondary earners. Austria is another interesting example, and I almost wanted to say as a caveat, we'll see what happens now, because they've elected quite a right of center government. But interestingly, in Austria, they enshrined in legislation and law the requirement to do gender-based analysis of all their budgets. So every department, every ministry has to have at least one goal and one proposal in terms of spending that addresses gender inequality. And you can see that they've already amended their tax system as well, so they've lowered taxation on secondary earners because basically they want to encourage more female labor force participation, and they also want to give women training in labor market programs. Now, I mentioned to you the UK Women's Budget Group. This is a really interesting group that works outside of government. So it's people like me, but then people who are also in different social organizations, women's organizations, trade unions. They've existed since 1979, and they do a very, very rigorous analysis each year of the UK budget. And one of the things that they have found through their studies is that when first the coalition government came in 2010, and then it was followed by the present Conservative government, they brought in what's known as a politics of austerity, so cutting back quite severely in the public sector. And they found that women were really disproportionately affected by these kinds of measures. And they found that 86% of the savings from the tax and benefit measures that were being proposed by the government were actually going to come out of women's pockets. And they actually did also a very interesting analysis of different kinds of households. So female single-headed households, old age pensioners' households, where a lot of women were also living singly, and they were able to really target that. And what they're basically saying is, look, you have to do this kind of an analysis because people are not sharing the burden equally. In fact, they show that people at the top end are doing much, much better, And the people who are really paying for what's considered, sound fiscal policy are the poor and the lower middle class. Now in Canada, we've done some independent research because up to now there hasn't been a lot of government-sponsored research. I should say that there used to be quite a lot of interesting and vibrant and respected independent research that was done through Status of Women Canada, which is the federal department that is responsible for taking forward the equality agenda as their sole focus. But in the last 10 years before this government, Status of Women was really cut back substantially, and its mandate for actually commissioning independent research was cut because the previous government said that's politics. We don't want Status of Women funding political research. We want them to basically be a service organization to women's groups across the country and to give government advice on how to do gender-based analysis. So Kathleen Leahy, who is a tax lawyer at Queen's University, she's done some really interesting work, and she found that when she looked at the 2012 budget, tax cuts were very gender regressive. So if you even looked at the kind of least regressive, so by regressive I mean that those who are at the lower end pay more, as opposed to progressive where people who earn more pay more, that even personal income tax cuts meant that 60% would go to men and 40% to women. Here at York, Brenda Spotton-Visano, who is an economist and public policy specialist who's working with me in establishing what we call the Gender Budget Lab at York, where we're trying to encourage this kind of research and do it. She found that there was a big push for infrastructure spending, as I mentioned, physical infrastructure, but a lot of that really created employment for men because it was targeted at construction, engineering, resource extraction, manufacturing. And you can see the numbers here in terms of who were actually about how many women were in those sectors. So that's, again, I think the counter argument would be it's good. We need that kind of infrastructure investment. Obviously, we need to keep up bridges, roads. We need to extract resources. But at the same time, we should balance that with thinking about our social infrastructure and taking care of the care economy. So finally, I've done a paper with Lisa Phillips, who is actually the interim vice president at the moment, and she is actually also a tax specialist at Osgood. And we did something that we thought was really interesting. We found that there were some very significant studies that have come out the last couple of years amongst tax specialists. Don't close your eyes and yawn, but because they were really concerned about what's contributing to the rising income inequality within Canada. And they focused on the very rich, so the top 1% or the 0.01%. And they looked at tax expenditure. So it's basically where the government says you don't have to pay taxes, we're giving you a break. It's a tax break. And they found, obviously, that the top 1% benefited disproportionately from tax breaks. But what we said was, okay, first of all, they didn't look at, is it just the top men? Do the top women also benefit? And secondly, they don't look at the other income groups. So there's 10 income groups from the very poorest to that 0.01%. So we took their same data. And this is what I mean when I talk to government, when they say, oh, we don't have the data. I say, yes, you have the data, but you have to manipulate it and think about it creatively. And we actually determined that men tend to do better with tax expenditures, even in the lower income deciles where women predominate, because they tend to be at the lower end of the income scale. But then we also found something really interesting, which was that some of the tax expenditures that favored women were actually expenditures that could advance gender equality, because women were claiming more in the expenses that you see here. So it wasn't all bad news, which I think is also important to show that you can use the tax system in a very positive way to advance your gender equality goals. Okay, so to sum up, where are we at now? I just was in Ottawa yesterday at Finance, meeting with a team from the OECD who has come to Canada to actually meet with people, not just people in government and legislators, but also people like me outside, to find out where gender budgeting is at, what they should be doing, etc. So they've come in to advise the government. And of course, the government's committed to continue doing a gender budget statement, but there were a lot of expectations, I think, that weren't met in the last one. It was a pretty general statement. It was a good start, everybody thought, but it didn't really go far enough. And one of the things that I think would be really, really important to push for is to get the government to think through its budget about investing where women actually work. So investing in them as teachers, as nurses, as social workers, in the social sector. And of course, I think that we could make a powerful case about what economists call the multiplier effect of social infrastructure. That if you put in a certain amount of money, it yields a lot more immediately and further down the road. And I think the second thing is to really just keep and this isn't just government, but I think it's also community groups who have been active in monitoring policy, is to also keep disaggregating wherever possible, and not just between men and women, but to realize that different groups of women are differently placed in the economy, as are men, and to have that kind of not just gender-sensitive analysis, but an analysis that looks at different kinds of social markers and tries to take that into account. That's it. Thank you very much.